Greetings and welcome to the 11th chapter of our video series about human resource at HRMN 300. My name is Professor Kevin Matthews, and this video we're going to be talking about working with labor unions. And one of the reasons why, and if you've been watching the video series over time, you've probably noticed that I have, periodically I've mentioned unions, and so much, not so much because, well, I mean, they were relevant to the topics at the time, but part of the reason why I've been bringing them up is because I have a history of being in a labor union, and then I've also had some work where I've worked at companies that have had labor unions where I was not a member of the union. So I've had multiple facets of dealing with all of this, and so I find the topic of unions fascinating, and the reason I really find it fascinating is this is an area where if you're looking for your job and you're out there and you say, okay, I want to put out my resume in order to work for these various companies, and if they have a labor union that they're dealing with, oftentimes they're going to ask if you have any experience with the unions. And so and the reason why it's kind of important is, as we've talked about at some points during the video, I've talked about, well, these are sort of the rules that you have to follow unless you have a labor union. And we're going to kind of talk about this much more in detail, which I think is it's a great topic. One of the concerns, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, the presence of unions in the United States has actually been diminishing for the past probably about 20-30 years. Actually, no, let me back up on that. That would be more like 20, I'd probably say 40-45 years. I would say that they were really at their height sort of in the 60s, maybe it started waning in the 70s. And and I think a lot of that had to do with the changing landscape of the United States. When the United, like I said, actually I'll talk more about that in detail as we go through that. But how this relates to me, and I'm kind of torn. I mean, if you were to ask me personally, how do I feel about labor unions? I see the benefit of them, and I see that they fit their time. But I think that they work well with certain industries. And I think that there's other industries where they don't work so well, and it's not because labor unions are good, bad, and different, and management is good, bad, and different. I just think that we've seen historically in the United States that the labor unions really have kind of have focused themselves on certain industries, and they haven't been able to do so in other industries. A very good example, and I get this question oftentimes: why have McDonald's workers not formed unions yet? And that's kind of complex. I think that part of the reason why is management would be all over that in 10 seconds. What can they do? What can they not do? There's been some talk that I've heard from people about, forming unions for hourly wages, hourly wage individuals who are around the minimum wage. And, some companies deal with this, aggressively, and some companies, they're going to deal with it not so much aggressively, but they provide such a positive experience for their employees that they don't see a need for the unions. And so that's kind of how unions have generally worked in the past. Where you have seen unions really sprout up is where you've seen a lot of, I would say, worker abuses. And when I say worker abuses, I'm not literally talking about the guy who shows up and literally canes people. Although, in the far past, there definitely was a lot of physical abuse that was going on. But, I'm also talking about abuses where people are trying to pay below market wages. And, a very good example, if you live in a small town, and say, for example, the town's only got a population of about 50,000, and you have one company that employs, 1,000 to 2,000 people because they have a factory or whatever. If you lose your job at that place, it's difficult for you to go somewhere else and find a job. I mentioned in previous videos that I used to work in Spokane, Washington, and Kaiser Aluminum was unionized. I mean, there were definitely some of the workers were union. I couldn't tell you who they were. I'd never actually dealt with Kaiser as a whole. But, you know, if you were in the steel industry and Kaiser decided to fire you for whatever reason, there really wasn't nowhere else for you to go. And so I think that, you know, unions were kind of a sprout up of, you know, making sure that the employees were taken care of by a management that might not have wanted to do so otherwise, because there really was nowhere else for workers to go if they were specialized in that trade, unless they were willing to upend their family and move somewhere else, like Pennsylvania or somewhere. And so that's kind of the difficult part about all this, is that, you know, where is it that unions tend to work out best and where they don't. And look, if I was going to talk about this topic at length, I could spend, you know, 5-6 hours on this. I've actually been wrestling with the idea of unions for many years. Not so much that, you know, like I said, I started off when I was a lot younger being very pro-union. And then, you know, when I actually worked in my union, I kind of lost a little faith in them. And it wasn't so much that the union industry as a whole had done bad things. It was more along the lines of the union that I was interacting with had a few bad actors who, quite frankly, didn't do their job, and as a result of which, we ended up deunionizing because our union wasn't taking care of us. And it seemed like the company was going to try and do a better job of taking care of us. And I, you know, for the short amount of time that I was there, they did. And so I didn't have any issues with, you know, with the deunionization process, because I felt at that time it was justified and fair. But as I've gotten older and I've actually had time to read this topic, I've kind of come to the realization, and forgive me for continuing a rant a little bit, but I've kind of come to the realization that there's certain areas and you know, in certain industries where unions just have their place, and it's not so much that you know, it's you know, and again, I think it comes down to the fact of, if management's not willing to take care of you, people will find somebody that will take care of them. And that's where, you know, labor unions can be a good place for them to find some, you know, an organization that works on their behalf. Now, I will tell you, you know, and again, my personal experiences with our union is I didn't think they were working on our behalf. You know, the gentleman who used to come in, I mean, I knew him very well, and the reason is that when he would come and do his inspections of the property, you know, we had two groups that were unionized. We had one group which was the food service group, and then we had the other group which was housekeeping. Okay. I remember I was talking, you know, this is probably about 2 or 3 months after I had started working there, and I was overhearing a conversation between 3 housekeepers who were talking that, you know, they didn't understand why they were paying this union dues. They never actually met their union reps. And I, you know, picked up my stuff and moved over, and just kind of said, well, you know, the union rep comes here every Tuesday. You know, he comes in and he visits the bar. He doesn't come down to see you guys. They're like, we've never seen him. And that's where I was kind of like, wow. So what would happen is the union rep would come into my bar, order a Miller Lite, you know, sit there and eat peanuts, talk to me about things, ask me how I was thinking about stuff, and then would leave. You know, and unbeknownst to me, I thought that he was walking around talking to the, you know, the kitchen people, to various other people. And another thing was that and what shaped me, and this wasn't so much the union's fault, several of my close friends that I associated with that we worked all together felt that this union rep wasn't doing his job, and it stopped becoming about him, and said, well, if he's doing his bad job, obviously the industry, the entire union itself really doesn't care. And I think that's where we started getting into the idea that this isn't good for us anymore, and as a result of which, we're just going to go ahead and deunionize. And this happens periodically. If your union boss doesn't seem to come around and look like they care for you, it's going to be a problem. Now, I have seen where some workers were treated very horribly by management of an organization, and if it wasn't for a union standing in for them, and other members of the union kind of saying, hey, look, we got to take care of our brothers here, they would have been really treated horribly, and they would have been forced to quit their job and go move somewhere else. There just was no other opportunity for them to find work. within a small town like that. So again, I'm torn, and I know that there's going to be people in this audience who are going to say, I hate unions, or I love unions, or, you know, unions are the greatest thing, or unions are the most horrible thing. I'm going to tell you, and this kind of comes down to the field of diversity also, it comes down to a lot of other areas that we've talked about in these classes. You have to set aside your personal feelings about the topic, and you have to do what's in the best interest of the company, because the company is hiring you hoping that you will do that. Okay, now if you love unions and you work for a company that has a very aggressive union or hostile union, you know, you might be the thing that breaks the ice that gets them to stop being hostile. You know, and you know, conversely, if you're a person who, you know, has a very good union that's working with them, and you absolutely can't stand unions, you know, that could be some of the tension that actually helps to serve the best needs of your company. So I think both sides can have a very good place to play here, and I think it's very important. But again, there's, you know, and you might ask yourself, why am I doing this? It's kind of like what I was doing with the diversity chapter. I'm kind of telling you a little bit about my background, my thoughts, my processes. And here's part of the reason why. When you're watching these videos, you're getting my take on things. I don't think it's fair that I give you my take on things if you don't understand my history, my background, my biases, and other things. But it's also important for you to understand your biases towards a specific topic. And it's very important, especially as we talk about topics like, you know, diversity, you know, and unions, where there can be high passions on both sides of the issue. And like I said, there's, you know, and I told you my opinion on diversity. I've told you my opinion on unions. And then, of course, there's also my opinions on compensation. There's definitely some people that have very high passions about compensation issues. But we have to divorce ourselves from our personal feelings and do what's in the best interest of the company, because guess who's hiring us? It's the company. All right. Now, if you can do something that does the best interest of the company and at the same time does the best interest of you, more power to you. Okay, that's the best way to go. If you can help the company and help your employees, phenomenal. That's awesome. I'm very happy for you on that. Now, with all that's kind of said, we'll kind of go over the book. So, page 1, you know, they kind of talk about, you know, they get you warmed in like they do with the other stuff. Unhappy employees could equal unionization. This book, sometimes this book does something and I just kind of go, I'd scratch my hair if I had any, and try to figure out, well, why are they doing this? And I kind of understand why they brought this up. I don't think unhappy employees always equal unionization. I think unhappy employees equal less productivity. And less productivity means lower sales, means lower, you know, the company itself doesn't succeed. And the good news is, that thought process probably takes more of a precedent today than it did, say, 100 years ago. And as a result of which, you know, I think that might be contributing partially to the decline of unions that we've seen over the past, you know, 40 or some odd years. Again, you know, my personal, you know, read this, go ahead and get yourself in the mood for it, but keep a salt shaker nearby so you can take it with some salt, okay? And I would say take it with a grain of salt. I think you're going to need more of a dash. Okay. So in this section, we're going to talk about the nature of unions. The learning objectives for this chapter are going to be able to explain the history of labor unions, explain some of the reasons for declining union membership over the past 60 years. They say 60 years. I'm more thinking about 40 years. Be able to explain the process of unionization and laws that relate to unionization. So then they talk about a labor union is defined as workers banding together to meet common goals and objectives such as better pay, benefits, promotion rules, blah, blah, blah. In the United States, 11.9% of Americans belong to a union, down from 21% in 1983. I would be curious as to what it would be in the 70s, because I think in the 70s and the 60s it was even higher than that. But So, and they talk about why, they talk about the decline in membership, and they say, in order to really hit this, we're going to talk about why people would join a union to begin with. And they talk about this, and they give the following reasons. People may feel their economic needs are not being met and believe that a union can help. Fairness in the workplace is another reason. And that scheduling, vacation time, transfers, and promotions are not given fairly, and that a union might be able to help out. So, and that kind of gets back to what I was saying earlier. If your workers kind of feel like that management's taking advantage of them, it makes it right for an organizational union to come in and basically say, hey, look, they're not taking care of you. And we'll talk a little bit about the history of unions. Now, I want you to, another sort of bias that I'm going to bring up here. This might shock you. Actually, HR and accounting were not my bachelor degrees when I went to school. I actually got a degree in Asian studies, international studies, a concentration in Asian areas. And, I bring that out because I love history. I love history. I love politics. When I studied both subjects, I really enjoyed it. And as a result of which, when they want to talk about the history of something, I geek out. And so if I go a little bit above board, I apologize. But when they talk about the history of unions, so they say they were developed in Europe during the Industrial Revolution. Now you have to understand, the Industrial Revolution in Europe did not take place at the same time it did in the United States. We were actually behind them. The Industrial Revolution was really kind of, ended up taking place really, I would say, 1830s, 1840s is really when it started taking off. And so, when you ask most Americans when do they think the Industrial Revolution, if they remember their history at all, and don't get me started on that, I think, people not understanding their history is very dangerous. Most people would say it's in the late 1800s, and that's, once we got past the Civil War, once Reconstruction started happening, I would say around the 1870s is when we started seeing this big boom of industries growing, especially in the North, because the North wasn't that destroyed after the Civil War. In the South, farming was still a way of life, but over time, I think that, they were rebuilding the South, and then they were rebuilding various parts and sections of it, and industry started helping the South, become a little bit more efficient. But it really wasn't until the Civil War got over that our Industrial Revolution really started taking off. And so when you start talking about, Industrial Revolution in Europe, you're talking 1850s, 1860s. And if you've ever read some of the good, some of the famous philosophers. I'll say famous philosophers. I don't want to put judgment on them, but you've got Marx, you've got Engels, you have some of the other sort of what I would call these guys were Marx and Engels were kind of sort of seen as the founders of the communist idea. And communism really grew out from the unions. I mean, that's kind of what they thought was that the state should control all resources. And again, I want to divorce yourself from political ideas or divorce yourself from the passions of the topic. There was a lot of suffering going on in the mid 1800s. Okay, and I'll tell you that it's no surprise that they were willing to listen to people who were standing up there saying, hey, workers should really be running things around here because we outnumber them, and they take all of our hard work and labor, pay us next to nothing, and they're benefiting off of it. There's definitely a persuasive argument to be made there, particularly in Europe, and also I would say in Russia, because towards the late 1800s in Russia, at that time, the czars were still in charge, and they were really late to the game when it came to the industrial age. And much like, and it's interesting, if you really want to understand how Russia is today, you should really study the history of Russia at the time of the Industrial Revolution for them, because the system really hasn't changed that much. As far as the political systems, it's really run by an oligarchy. And what I mean by an oligarchy is a political system that basically it's not run by one person. That would be a dictatorship. But an oligarchy is where there's a small group of individuals or a small group of small groups is really the people that are running the country. And today a very good example would be Russia. I mean, there's certain people that Putin needs on his side in order to maintain power. And now, if you go against Putin, he'll be very quick to put it down. And so there's some people who make an argument that it's more like a dictatorship rather than rather than an oligarchy. But I mean, there's the oligarchs, these massive billionaires. They're definitely running things out there. And so, but Russia was starting to kind of, during the Industrial Revolution, there was sort of the rise of the oligarchs. And that's when you started seeing a lot of the power of the czars start to fade. And especially a lot of the population was not favoring the Russian czars because of the conditions that were in existence at that time. And so this really gave rise to a lot of, workers' rights issues. Like I said, these guys are making, at that time, millions of dollars. Of course, back in the 1800s, millions of dollars is equal to like billions of dollars for us, or trillions of dollars even. These guys are making buku bucks off of the backs and the sweat of the lower guy. And so there was a massive sort of, attempt. Now, like I said, Marx and Lenin and I'm trying to think of the name of the other guy that was at the same time as Lenin. But they, they really kind of ended into this. Now, their goals were politically motivated. Their goals were that they wanted to, to overthrow the Tsar. But, there are other organizations like the labor unions. They weren't so much as politically motivated, but they were economically motivated. And they saw the suffering of the people, and they said, look, if we band together, they have to negotiate with us. And if they don't, we refuse to work, they don't get any money. Okay, so that's kind of how it was happening over in Europe and also in what was then known as, and actually now known as Russia. Now, in the United States, we were talking about, what really hit us that caused us to have an increase in unionization, and they mention it here, was really the railroad industry. And as a person who has a Chinese wife, believe me, I understand the history, and this was part of the Asian studies that I did, where there were a vast number of Chinese laborers that came over to work in the railroads. They're very horribly mistreated. Many of them were just making money, sending it back to China to take care of their families, who was at that time had probably had just survived the Opium Wars, where England had defeated China, or defeated the Qing dynasty at that time, and as a result of which they got a control of Hong Kong. You can see how all of this is really related. But the Chinese laborers who were coming here, they were basically, look, they're being mistreated. Now, again, it's not like the unions were helping them. Okay, and I'll tell you, I could go into like I said, if I talked about the history of this could be a 5-hour video easily, and I don't want to waste everyone's time with that. But non-Chinese laborers who worked in the railroad industry were treated pretty horribly too. And I don't care what race you were, they were really treated horribly. And as a result of which, they had the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and several other brotherhoods focus on specific tasks, such as conductors and brakemen were formed to protect workers' rights. Although many workers were filed because of their membership, and back in those days, they asking you if you were a member of the union was a perfectly legitimate legal question. And if you were, they may not even hire you, let alone, if you lied about it afterwards, or later on joined the union, it was a fireable offense. So the first local unions in the United States were formed in the 18th century in the form of the National Labor Union. The National Labor Union formed in 1866 to pave the way for other labor organizations. The goal of the NLE was form a labor federation that could lobby the government for reforms. Now, You had unions that were really concerned about the membership, obviously, but then you had other groups that were basically like, look, if we're going to be able to work in these environments, or if we're going to be able to support our people in these environments, we're going to have the law on our side. And just like any other powerful political group, labor unions rose to that task, and so they would spend time lobbying the government, just like a lot of other lobby activities go on, to get a lot of labor laws passed. They said its main goal was to limit work days to 8 hours, while the NLU garnered many supports. It excluded Chinese workers and only made some attempts to defend the rights of African Americans and female workers. See, and that's one thing I don't like about the book here. They don't even talk about why the Chinese workers were even important. If I hadn't explained it to you, you wouldn't have even known. So again, sorry about ranting, but this is where I kind of get a little bit ticked off with it. And but of course not just the Chinese, but also African Americans. I mean, in 1862, the Civil War was going out and it was ravaging at that time. Okay, and of course, slavery hadn't been abolished by 1862. And so, that's kind of where things had progressed in the United States. And so the NLU can be credited with the 8-hour workday, which was passed in 1862 because of a focus on government reform rather than collective bargaining. Many workers joined the Knights of Labor in the 1880s. This is where you started seeing more, trying to get to the lower guy. They just the lower guy was, and basically where the lower guy said, I don't give a darn what happens in Congress. I mean, most of them probably didn't even know who Congress was or what Congress was, if they did at all. All they cared about was, I go to work for this man, he treats me horribly, and I don't get my fair share. And as a result of which, I need somebody to work on my behalf. And that's where you started seeing a lot of these other unions come up. And they were talking about how this really happened in the 1880s, like I said earlier. This is where you started seeing a lot more unions that were kind of bringing up to defend workers' rights. There's actually a really good movie about labor union forming. It was actually, the star of it was Sylvester Stallone. I can't remember the name of the movie for the life of me. I'll get it and put it down here in the video. But I mean, I would take a look and watch it, because I mean, it's interesting because like nowadays, if you think of labor union movies, you think of the guy who threatens to go after the person who doesn't want to be a member of the union. I mean, when you take a look at the history of labor unions, these guys were poorly treated. I mean, the organizational leaders at that time would hire people who had the main goal of threatening and doing anything necessary inside and outside of the law to discourage people from joining these labor unions and running amok of things. And that's where they talked a little bit about and they talk about this with the Knights of Labor. The Knights promoted social and cultural spirit of the worker better than the NLU had. It grew as a labor union for coal miners, but also covered some other industries. And that's something you're going to notice here. I think we were a member of the AFLCIO when I was at the Doubletree, which previous to that was the Sheraton, and that's actually the property that got unionized. It's kind of funny because I remember when I was a member of the AFL-CIO, I was like, I knew these guys as like, in the car industries. I didn't know they did anything for us food workers. So it was actually a very eye-opening experience for me when I joined my labor union that these guys were involved with that. And they talk a little bit about the history of them. Yeah, the American Federation of Labor, which was formed in 1866, there were people who wanted to see a change from the Knights of Labor. In the 1930s, the Congress of Industrial Organizations was formed as a result of political differences in the AFL. But in 55, they joined together to form the AFL-CIO. So that's kind of a brief history of the AFL-CIO and how they came in. It's the largest federation of unions in the United States, made up of 56 national and international unions. The goal isn't to negotiate specific contracts, but rather to support the efforts of local unions. And that's something you need to understand. When we talk about unions as a whole, it's not like there's one man at the top that controls the whole thing. And, I mean, we're not talking about, and forgive the metaphor on this, we're not talking about the evil organization of Cobra, and we've got Cobra Commander at the top who's running everything. This is a very decentralized event. It's a very decentralized organization, and the local guys have a lot of control when dealing with a lot of issues that they have. And if you think about it, it actually makes more sense to do that, because what's good for Michigan's laborers and what's good for Spokane's laborers and what's good for North Carolinians laborers is vastly different. There's different needs that each area would have. And so you really need, it has to be the organization at the bottom that really, in order to be able to better serve their employees, because, I mean, could you imagine if you were a member of a labor union, you've been sending off, I remember when I joined, I was probably making about $250 a week, $500 a paycheck, and I was sending, roughly about $60 of that every single 2 weeks to this organization. And of course, mine was the highest because we were bartenders, and bartenders made the most money. But it really bothered me, because it would have bothered me if, they said, hey, we'd like to help you out, Kevin, but unfortunately we can't because, the national guys won't let us do this. Something that kind of turned me away from my union, in addition to the story that I told you earlier, I had a tooth problem. Really, really bad. I mean, it was extremely painful. I eventually did go to the dentist, and I remember with the dentist, he said he put the drill to my tooth and it exploded. That's how bad it was rotting. I mean, it was horrible, because I hadn't seen a dentist in years, because I didn't have health insurance anymore. I wasn't covered under my dad's policy because I was too old at that time. But and I remember going to the labor union saying, hey, I've been working with you guys for a while. Is there a way that I can get on the insurance? And I was 3 weeks away from getting on insurance. And I said, is there a way that I could get on insurance, 3 weeks early? And the labor union was like, no, we won't. You're going to get on when everybody else gets on. And I understand why they said what they said, but if you think about it, if they really, and again, this was the labor guys that were there. It's not the AFLCIO as a whole. Trust me, I'm not trying to rank on them as a whole, but these guys just didn't take care of people. And maybe they could have gone back and said, hey, Kevin, you know what? We know you can't afford to go to the dentist, so what we're going to do is we'll send you to the dentist, we'll pick up the bill and take care of it. Could you imagine how much loyalty I would have with the unions at that point? Just something like that. And I've heard, and I've never experienced this myself, but I've heard where people who are members of very, very close-knit unions, they'll do stuff like that. They'll be like, hey, so-and-so can't, is having some financial issues, or so-and-so is having problems. They band together and they help people out. But they didn't, and like I said, it contributed. It wasn't the main reason. The main reason, of course, was when I began to realize that my person, he didn't seem like he cared about anybody, except for coming in and having his beer and talking to me. And I thought, and then he even abandoned me, and I was like, okay, fine. So, they talk about currently in the United States, there's two main labor unions that oversee industry-specific unions. You have the AFL-CIO, and then you have the CTW. CTW, Change to Win Federation, includes the Teamsters, Service Employees Union International, which is SEIU, United Farm Workers of America, and United Food and Commercial Workers. Independent unions, there's Directors Guild of America, Fraternal Order of Police, Independent Pilots Association, and Major League Baseball Players Association. And why are these guys really independent? And part of the reason why is because their industries are usually so far out, or their membership is so shall we say, different than the membership of the other organizations. So, for example, generally speaking, you've got like a lot of these, the SEIU, a good majority of the SEIU labor members are, service workers, hospitality, restaurants, things of that nature, farm workers of America, food and commercial workers. These are not extremely high labored, jobs. Imagine if, a member of the American League Baseball Players Association was a member of the AFLCIO and they feel, does it really fit? I don't think it does. And of course, I think another reason why they're different is just because of the way it rose out. But it's interesting, and one thing that I didn't even think about this when I initially reviewed the chapter, the Guild of America. Guilds actually have you don't want to talk about history, they actually have a very, very big history, especially in Europe. I mean, and these guilds were trade organizations that existed way back to the Dark Ages. I mean, and basically what would happen is, a very good example, if you're a Masoner, I'm a Freemason. That's different than a stonemason. A stonemason is the one who actually does stonemasonry. I mean, takes stone and shapes it into the shape that needs to be. If you think about it, there may be a major building project going on in a town that once the major building project's done, there's no work for anybody. And as a result of which, you have to travel. Okay, so if you're a masoner, where you do stonemasonry, or if you're, say a blacksmith, and part of the stuff that you do is for construction, maybe you're a lumberer, and so, or other tradesmen. Sometimes what happens is a lot of those big projects that need several tradesmen, they can't support people afterwards, and as a result of which it sort of made it migratory, which is kind of interesting, and I find it interesting. I think why a majority of people who are Europeans are all mutts. I'm part Swedish, Scottish, Irish. I think there's some Belgium in me. There's some French in me. I'm sure it's probably because my ancestors have long gone were walking all over Europe because they were just looking for places to work. You can have some people who are part German, part Romanian, part Hungarian, part Croatian. It's phenomenal because what happened is you had this big migratory pattern that was happening with a lot of these tradespeople, and so if you wanted to get into that trade, the way it would be is that you would join your local guild, and then the guild was part of a greater network. That if you were, a stonemasoner, for example, and you worked and you got an apprenticeship and you became proficient in how to do stonemasonry, you could then travel around and receive those types of wages, and so. I find it fascinating because they're not called guilds anymore. I mean, I would say that the father of the modern labor union is really the guildsman, because depending on what kind of union you have, we'll talk about this a little bit later on. If you want to work in that trade, you may not necessarily apply for your job at the company and say, I want to be assigned apprenticeship. That's not how that works. You're going to go to the trade union and you're going to say, I want to become an electrician. So I join the union, I become an apprentice, and then I learn how to become an electrician because they assign me to somebody. Okay, so you're going to work with someone who is, going to do various things, and so that's kind of how that works out. And again, I'm sorry for going down a deep path on history, but I think it's very important because, like I said, guilds are just so. I find them fascinating because I remember reading old stories about medieval Europe and how the stonemasons or how the blacksmiths would travel from town to town to town, and they, the guilds were there to support them. Sometimes provide cheap lodging, sometimes provide them abilities to learn additional crafts, and things of that nature, in order to get better. And so they kind of rose on their own. So they say that the National Union plays an important role in the legislative changes, and I would say, yeah. So when you see AFLCIO, CTW, and the other unions, they'll go they'll go to Congress all the time, and and they're the ones who are whining and dining and trying to lobby Congress in order to get certain labor laws passed. Some of the changes they want, they lobby the governments for workers' rights, to resolve disputes between unions, and also help organize national protests. And it's kind of funny because here in the United States, we don't celebrate May Day very much. And I think part of the reason why is because of the history of it. May Day is really associated with communism because, the good old days of the 1950s, 1960s, the old USSR used to have these huge May Day parades. And in fact, what they would do is, I remember, talking to military analysts, in the old days, if you wanted to really understand what, if you want to understand the political structure of what was going on at the time, if you wanted to understand the weaponry that was going on at the time, you watched the May Day parade. And so the military analysts would watch these parades, and the reason why they were watching them is because back in those days, we didn't necessarily have good information as to who was in charge, and they would, analyze the little footsteps and all that sort of stuff. Again, going a little bit off topic, but for the most part, May Day was associated with that because the biggest parade that they would have in the Soviet Union generally was around May because, and I think they did this for a couple reasons. Number one, the Communist Party always saw itself as a workers' party, and so, May Day being a day where they sort of celebrate labor issues and celebrate Labor Day, that's kind of the Labor Day as they call it in those countries. But in the United States, we really felt that as a negative thing, and so that's that kind of gets into the history of why we have Labor Day on a different day. We have ours on the first day of first Monday of the month in September. But May Day is still being celebrated around the world. I mean, and even in Europe, you start seeing stuff like that. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll organize protests around May Day, around various issues that they have. And so because, in Europe, for example, many people get days off right around May Day. I know in Japan, they celebrate May Day on, definitely not a communist nation. I would say you want to talk about it. They're vastly on the other side. But they celebrate May Day as Labor Day, but it's part of what they call Golden Week. So what ends up happening is you have a lot of people who are off for an entire week because it centers around Children's Day, and then not the current emperor, but the previous emperor, his birthday was on April 29th. So it made up this really nice long week that people could take off and go do a whole lot of things. Now, you don't see too many national protests in Japan. I mean, there are some. And there were definitely some when I was living there. But in Europe, I remember seeing the news reports about France's unions protesting, whatever. And oftentimes they're protesting when the government wants to raise the retirement age. Sound familiar? So I would say, because like here in the United States, you don't see too many labor union protests, at least not anymore. There definitely existed in the history books, but it does, for example, I mean, you don't see, like I said, I just don't see them too often anymore. Now, I live in the Washington, D.C. metro area. I've lived here since 2009. I haven't seen them that much. Now, if they did exist before that, I apologize if I'm wrong, but you just don't see it as often. And I think part of the reason why is just because labor unions have been in decline for so long. They give you an example of the National Teamsters Union organized demonstrations in 11 states to protest the closing of an Ontario, California parts center. And that's kind of what ends up happening. If they find out that an organization is going to try to close something because of, for unfair reasons, sometimes you'll have it to where protests will erupt. But I mean, I don't even remember in 2011 if this even hit the news. Maybe it did, but it doesn't seem as big as it used to. Figure 11.1, they're going to give you the complicated structure of the AFLCIO. You can take a look at it. Okay, so current union changes. The labor movement is currently experiencing several challenges, including a decrease in union membership, globalization, and workers' focus on maintaining non-union status. As mentioned in the opening section, is the decline since the 1950s. I've seen some numbers where they said that actually the 60s was really more of where the unions started experiencing some of those declines. They said in the 50s, 36% of all workers were unionized as opposed to just over 11% today. He believes, the Claude Fisher, who's a researcher from UC Berkeley, believes that the shift is cultural. And I would agree with that. I think that, first of all, I think businesses in the United States, I think, have been far more effective in and so there's a researcher there, the name of Claude Fisher, who's from UC Berkeley, who believes that the reason in the decline in union membership is actually a cultural one, and I tend to agree with that. I think that in the United States, businesses have been very, very successful tying unions to a couple of boogeymen, so to speak. The number one, I remember when, studying in history, back in the 1920s, 1930s, they were really tied very closely, 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, really tied closely to the Communist Party, and especially when we get into the 40s and the 50s with the Red Scare that was taking place. I think that, a lot of people began to feel that way. A second reason why I think that they did, and this was more later so, tying them directly to the mafia, and one area that I think probably had a profound effect on that was the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, who was a very well-known Teamsters, leader. One day disappears. They have no idea where he goes. Now, there's theories. Everyone's got ideas. One theory was that the government took him out because they didn't like him. Another theory that was that there's all sorts of crackpot theories that are out there. The one that seemed to have the most legs is that the mafia. He was involved with the mafia in some way, and somebody put a hit on him, and so and there's people who say that they kind of figured out what's going on. I've actually not followed this in a while. I used to be a follower of this story when I was a college student, but lately I really hadn't followed it too much. So why is it happening? I think those are two major issues. But I think a third issue, and one that doesn't get talked about very often, is that we have moved from a society that really focuses on, manufacturing over to a society that focuses a lot on providing services. And a lot of times the high-paying skilled services aren't going to unionize, and it's just because of the nature of the business. Like I said, it's the nature of the industries that really kind of prevented it from ever taking place. You just don't see unions, for example, at Silicon Valley. You don't see unions, for example, in the accounting industry. Believe me, if there's one place that I think we would have formed a union, I would think it would have been the accounting industry, because we work ourselves to death, from about the end of January all the way till April 15th. There's just this kind of, we do that. And so I'm actually kind of surprised that it wouldn't, if it would have happened anywhere, I think it would have happened in there. And, that's not to suggest that it's all high-paying jobs don't unionize. The first argument I would say is the pilots union. Pilots of airlines, for example, their union's been going strong for many, many years. In fact, and again, kind of relating to that, and another reason why I think that it's been demonized. I remember the union strikes that took place with Pan Am Flight 103 in the early 90s, where I still remember, back then, CNN was, one of the only news organizations that I watched back then. CNN was very big, going out and interviewing various people. There were still some people who were striking, and then you had some people who were crossing the line and working. Very negatively looked at, but these were people who kind of felt a loyalty to the company, and as a result of which they were willing to cross the labor line. As a result of the strikes, Pan Am went under. It never recovered as a result of that, and And so I think that also gave it some negative press too. There's been a lot of things that have really affected it in the United States. Whereas I think in Europe, I think with some other countries, particularly, but I would say Europe primarily. You've seen more and more where the unions have probably been a lot more effective in, sort of showing that they were the defender of the little guy, probably a little bit better than they did here in the United States. They say that in order to fully understand unions, it's important to recognize the global aspects, and that's what I was kind of talking about at the beginning of this. The book didn't really start that way, but they did. They did say that worldwide statistics show decline in unions, but they're still healthy in some countries. 8 of 27 European Union member states, more than half the working population is part of a union. In fact, in the most populated countries, unionization rates are still at 3 times the unionization of the United States. Italy has a unionization rate of 30% of workers. UK is 29. Germany is 27. And again, I think that what's ended up happening here in the United States is they've just done a much better job, at least the businesses really have, of kind of curbing that, whereas in Europe they just really didn't. And it's interesting, they mentioned cultural, and this is kind of another reason that I think that it could be a problem. In the United States, less so. Other countries more so. There's this idea of paternalism, and it's the idea that you are to be taken care of from cradle to grave. Whether that's by government, whether that's by a union, whether it's by the company. It's this idea of paternalism. It's very strong in Japan. It's very strong in Europe. But in Japan, the reason why we haven't seen, there are labor unions in Japan, believe it or not, but they're not as predominant as they are, in other parts of the world. And I think part of the reason why is because the Japanese companies, the companies were very, very good at saying, look, you come work for us, you're part of our family, we're going to take care of you. And I kind of get back to the Ouchi model that we were talking about in the past. Companies in the United States don't have that anymore. They used to I would say younger. There was the old story of, in the 40s you went to go work for, Ford. You never changed jobs. You retired from Ford after working there for, how many ever years. You got your juicy pension, and then, you go sit on go sit on your front porch and yell at kids to get off your lawn. That's kind of what was supposed to happen. And unfortunately, in the United States, we sort of saw that shift where businesses were more interested in keeping up with better profits, and worker loyalty was not seen as normal anymore. That really hadn't gone away in Japan probably until 2000s. The idea of swapping from one country to the next is still pretty difficult in Japan. You don't see that as often as they do here in the United States, but it's increasing more and more as the younger generations are more just like, look, I'm going to go wherever I'm taken care of. I'm not going to go work for one person for the rest of my life. In France, particularly, but other parts of the union, of the European Union, and I'm throwing the UK in there temporarily while they're still trying to figure out Brexit. You still see, this strong idea of paternalism that's taking place, and as a result of which, I think the unions have really appealed to that paternalism very easily and said, look, these massive companies don't care about you, and we're going to take care of you better than they are. And I think that they've done a really good job of that, and as a result of which their union rates have not gone down nearly as much as ours have, and of course the unions are also very into the government over there, and as a result of which many of the laws protect them at levels not seen like here in the United States. They kind of talk about Governor Scott Walker proposed limiting collective bargaining rights of state workers to save a failing budget. They call this union busting. Now, union busting is sort of this idea, and believe me, Scott Walker wasn't the first to try to do this. It's where, some companies were known to have managers that just everywhere they went, the union just kind of went away. Okay, I remember when we did our deunionization, there was an accusation that the main manager, the property manager, I can't remember his name right now, was a quote unquote union buster. What did not add to his to this was that 6 months after the deunionization took place, he was off on to another assignment. And so that kind of, there was the conspiracy theory that was going around that he was really here to bust up the unions. And again, I don't think he could have done anything to have busted the union. I think the union busted itself just because of the way they manage things. But the idea that you have managers that specifically specialize in going in and breaking up these unions is very prevalent. And so when you have a governor who basically says, "Look, we want to limit the collective bargaining rights of state workers," it was very serious. And I remember this was one of the protests that I do remember. And generally in the United States, if you're going to see a protest that usually happens that makes the news, it's usually one of two. It's either the government workers or it's also the teachers unions. And that's because I think that they've done a much better job of keeping people under the idea that, look, the administrations, your elected leaders are not going to take care of you, and as a result of which you need collective bargaining in order to be able to handle things. Now, I'm not of the mindset in any way, shape, or form that unions have been perfect. There's been some unions who've done a much better job of managing things than others, and all that. And I think that with the benefits, like for example, the benefits that the unions were giving have been much better for their workers as a result of that. I mean, even though they wouldn't let me go on the health insurance, I do know that the health insurance that we had with the union compared to what we would have had with the company, my understanding, had to up its game in order to make things go better for us, because they didn't want to have people sort of regretting this and then reforming a union. I just think that it was interesting in the sense that it did cause some organizations to up their game, and that's where I kind of get to where people kind of talk to me about being pro or against unions. I think they have their role. If a company feels that they're not treating their people right and they're worried about unions coming in, I think that the answer that they should have and what we should be offering to them is, well, offer better benefits, take care of your people more, go out there and instead of talking about how they're constant costs, talk to them like they're human beings. Less theory X, more theory Y. And not to suggest that everybody is going to buy into that. But I think that it comes down to it. If the company takes care of people, they're going to not have they're not going to have to worry too much about it. But unfortunately, they don't always listen to what I think. So labor union laws. The Railroad Labor Act of 26 was originally applied to railroads, and in 36 it was amended to cover airlines. So they received support from both management and unions. The goal of the act was to ensure no disruption of interstate commerce. And this is sort of this is where they kind of get into. And I remember there was a labor strike at one point where I think it was airline stewardesses were striking for whatever reason. Now the stewardesses were still going to work, they were still doing their jobs, but when they weren't working, they would go and they would picket on the line in order to get things going on. And I think that was kind of some of the reason behind all of this. So the RLA was administered by the National Mediation Board back then, a federal agency. It outlines very detailed process for dispute resolutions of these industries. And that's usually what happens is sometimes the government gets involved. I remember there was a movie about the American President with Michael Douglas and what's her name? Annette Bening. That's who it was. I was going to say Anne Hathaway. I was like, no way. She's way too young to be in that movie for that. But the president's trying to fly over to mediate a labor dispute. And sometimes if the labor dispute gets big enough, big heavy hitters will go in and basically say, look, I want to mediate the dispute, we want to get people back to work. And sometimes it does have to go to arbitration. But usually if there's an arbitration process that is in existence, it'll be part of the union contract. And so, there's arbitration people, that's what their whole job is to mediate disputes between people using the spirit of the agreement, so to speak, or the agreements themselves. In 1932, the Norris-LaGuardia Act of 32 barred federal courts from issuing injunctions against nonviolent labor disputes and barred employers from interfering with workers to join a union. This is where we're going to start getting into, and I'm kind of bringing this up. I talked about this in a previous video where when we talk about labor unions, there sort of was this back and forth that was kind of going on. So you'd have a law that gets passed that's favorable to the unions, and then you have a law that's favorable to those against the unions. And so it kind of goes back and forth and back and forth. And the Norris-LaGuardia Act of 32 was definitely a pro-union bill, because one of the things that it did is they would ban yellow dog contracts, which is where a worker agreed not to join a union before accepting the job. So if you want to come work for me, okay, that's fine. Here's a contract you're going to have to sign in order to say you'll never do a union. Okay, you want the job? And remember, 1932, what was going on at that time? The Great Depression. And so because the Great Depression was going on, the people would beg, borrow, and steal to get a job. I mean, unemployment was to the point that, it was huge. So, if you want me to sign a document in order to give me a job, sure, I'll do it. But it's, unions were starting to run into some issues as a result of that. And so they passed this law in order to do it. Basically, it made the yellow dog contracts unenforceable in court and established that employees were free to join unions without employer interference. In 35, the Wagner Act, sometimes called the National Labor Relations Act, was passed, changing the way employers can react to several aspects of unions. Employers must allow freedom of association, organization, cannot interfere with, restrain, coerce employees to form a union. Employers may not discriminate against employees who form or are part of a union or those who file charges, and an employer must bargain collectively with the representation of a union. And again, this is where we've got a couple laws that are passed that are really very pro-union, and it kind of makes sense because, what was happening at the time, 1929 we started the Great Depression. Hoover, kind of was like one of these, laissez-faire kind of guys who basically said, look, the economy will heal itself. I just need to stand back and let it do its job. And obviously, the economy kept tanking, and without his interference, people were suffering. And so as a result of which, what ended up happening is, people ended up, they ended up electing Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to become president in 1933. But in 32, there was still this huge push to get people to be more pro-union because some companies were taking advantage of the situation. Obviously you've got a labor pool that's much larger than what you have. Oh, you don't want to work for me? Good, I'll go get this guy and he'll come in here and he'll work for 10% less. Oh, you don't want to work? Oh, you want to work for 10% less? I'll go get this guy and he'll do it for even 10% less than that. So there's definitely a lot of abuses that were going on at the time. And you want to form a union? You're not even going to work here unless you want to sign this contract that basically says you agree not to form a union if you want to come work with me. So, one of the things that ended up happening against the Norris-LaGuardia Act and then the Wagner Act, another thing that ended up happening is the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, which even to this day is a very, very powerful organization. It says that it oversees handling of this act, handling any complaints that arise from this act. It does a lot more than just this act. Okay, the National Labor Relations Board does. It puts out policies and also puts out things that. And it basically works with an administrative court proceedings that's very similar to what the IRS has. If you file, a grievance with the NLRB, you get your case heard by the NLRB, which is an administrative court. It's not actually technically a court that falls under the judicial branch of the United States. Now, what does that mean? Basically, what it means is that it's subject to the whims of the president. And so the president has all the power to put whoever he wants to put on the NLRB, within certain reasons, of course. I think they still have to be confirmed by the Senate, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I'll try to check that and see if I can get that to you. So they talk about here, for example, in 2011, the NLRB worked with employees at the Osborne Hesse Logistics in Tennessee after they had been fired because of their involvement in forming a union. The company was also accused of interrogating employees about their union activities and threatened employees with the loss of benefits should they form a union. Obviously very illegal under the Wagner Act, and so again, this is now let me ask you this: if you're the HR of this company, what should you be doing? What you should be doing is you should be advising them that basically says, look, we've got a union that we have to deal with. Before we do this, let's go hire a lawyer that can actually, and there's lawyers that specialize on both sides of the issue. If you're a company that's afraid that you're going to deal with a union, you want somebody working on your behalf to make sure that you don't cross any laws, that you don't do anything that's illegal at the very least, and hopefully unethical on the other side. But if you are a group of employees who feel that you're being disparately treated, you can go hire a lawyer that specializes in getting unions formed, and there's definitely those out there that are happy to do that. Later on, they passed in 1947, which of course was 2 years after World War II ended, they passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which had major implications for unions and amended the Wagner Act. The act was introduced because of the upsurge in strikes during the time. And you got to understand, back in once World War II ended, we had this huge inflow of people coming back. Mostly men are coming back. Now, at that time, most of the factories were being managed or being worked on by the women and anybody else who wasn't qualified for military service, because of course back then women were not allowed to fight in the infantry and in a lot of the other combat roles. And so what ended up happening is the unions kind of started flourishing at this point because the majority of the jobs that were there, all these factories that had built all these tanks, all these war fighting materials, now that's got to be reconverted and retooled in order to build other things, like for example, cars is a very good example. Now it's interesting because there's a lot of manufacturing and a lot of other things that go on in the economy that has dual purpose, and so I think a very good example is that Jeeps they've got obviously they need Jeeps in the Army, but they also needed Jeeps for civilians. I mean, civilians definitely had a need for it too, and so that's there was a lot more transition that was allowed to happen with those. Unions started growing vastly. They grew more and more powerful using the Wagner Act to build upon that power. And what Taft-Hartley did is that it focused on what they would call unfair acts by unions. For example, it outlawed strikes that were not authorized by a union, called wildcat strikes. In other words, if you're just having a bad day and you throw down your tool and you're like, I'm done, and now you walk out and you grab 5 of your friends and you're like, you know what, I've had it, and of course they're your friends, so they're going to back you up, and so you guys start a strike all of a sudden. It basically, it bans those kind of things. It also prohibited secondary actions in which one union goes on strike in sympathy of another union. For example, if one of the unions that works in our company, maybe the Teamsters, the Teamsters group that we have here, unionizes all of the tool shops, and also some of the supply shop people, and then the people who are working on the front line are part of the maybe another union, AFLCIO. And so what happens is the Teamsters go on strike because of something that's going on, and AFL-CIO says, we want to be in line with our brothers or sisters, and we're going to go on strike. It outlawed doing something like that. There has to be a specific disagreement in order for it to happen. It also allowed the executive branch of the federal government to disallow a strike should a strike affect national health or security. And this is actually one of the things, yeah, and they talk about, I'm actually glad they did this, and I was thinking this myself. Ronald Reagan used this. Probably one of the more famous strikes that I remember in my life was the air traffic controllers. And it's kind of funny because when the air traffic controllers decided to go on strike, they had been off their job for 2 days despite a no strike oath, and Reagan basically was like, you know what? You're affecting national security. Y'all are fired. Fired every one of them. And what ended up happening is, well, obviously they need air traffic controllers. So they put out this massive call for air traffic controllers, brought people in, got them trained up. That wasn't too much of an issue. But it's kind of funny because I remember it was about 30 years after this, because this took place in what, 91? Yeah, so this took place in 81. I remember it was around 2011. I started seeing, because I'm involved with an organization called Civil Air Patrol, and we do a lot of we're trying to get people to learn how to fly and love flying and all that stuff. And then, of course, we do emergency services and a lot of other things. We received some updates that they really wanted some of our members to become air traffic controllers, because what had happened was all the people that had been hired in 81, 82, 83, they were all coming up for retirement age. and because you started with a clean slate, a good majority of them all came to retirement age right around the exact same time. So there was going to be this gluttony of positions that needed to go filled, and so it was seen as a very good opportune time if you really wanted to get into this industry. God bless the guys who do that, by the way. And when I say guys, I mean guys and girls. I've been a flyer for many years. I love flying, but the guys who manage the approach controls, the departure controls, and the airspaces up above 10,000 feet, I think it's, those guys, it can be a stressful job if you work in a very busy area, but I think it's, it allows us to go do the fun stuff that we do. And then they talk about the Landrum-Griffin Act, which is also the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosures Act, LMRDA. I've never called that. I've always gone with the Landrum-Griffin Act. It was passed in '59 and it required unions to hold secret elections, required unions to submit their annual financial reports to the Department of Labor, and created standards governing expulsion of a member from the union. It was created because racketeering charges and corruptions by unions. This is where you started getting into, like I said, in the 1950s, there was a lot of linking this to, subversive activities of communist organizations, but you also had this was where you started picking up a lot more of the organized crime aspect of it. And I think that, it's interesting, today, if you ask anybody if they have any links to the Communist Party, they wouldn't say anything, because most Americans don't know that. But they definitely know about the mafia connection, because, that's something that's much more publicly discussed as of today. Figure 11.3 talks about major acts regarding the unions, and I like how they line this out. I wish I could show it on the screen. I cannot. But I would go ahead and take a look at that if you have that. So next we're going to talk about the unionization process. There are two ways that a unionization process can begin. First, a union may contact several employees and discuss the possibilities of a union, or employees may contact the union on their own. And you could see this happening both ways. I remember somebody had told me about the way our union at Doubletree was formed, was that several employees felt that they were being unfairly treated. They contacted a union and they came in. So, and it wasn't the Doubletree at that time, it was the Sheridan at that time. So that's kind of how it went. And this is actually a very important thing that you need to know. To hold an election, the union must show signatures of 30% of the employees of the organization. That's not actually accurate. It's 30% of the employees that are going to be covered by the union. Okay, that's actually a mistake in your book. And the reason why I know this, number one, it was on the PHR exam. So if you're going to take the PHR, well, I don't know if it was exactly on the exam, but I know it was part of the preparation that I had to do. But this was a very big thing because, like I said, DoubleTree didn't have a union for everybody. Front desk was not unionized. I don't think maintenance was, but there were other aspects of it that were not unionized at all. As I recall, what is it? The catering service was not unionized, even though it was food service. They didn't get unionized on that. So what ended up happening is when you need to form the union, you got to figure out what's the group I'm protecting, and as a result of that, I have to have 30% of that group. So if you're looking at like front desk, maybe the front desk people, they don't have anything to complain about. And you're worried that by including them, it's going to bring your numbers down to below 30%. You may not want to cover them. And so that's sometimes how that ends up happening. Again, it's 30% of the employees who are going to be covered under it. You have to have those signatures in order to hold the election. And then they have to be secret ballot, because what they don't want to have happen is they don't want management watching, and as a result of which influencing certain people to be able to do this. And I remember when this whole deunionization was taking place, management didn't say anything to us, and I think that, and they didn't for a couple reasons. But I remember when the deunionization had taken place, and I stopped working there. I actually was still friends with one of the managers, but he said, I thought it was the best thing for you guys, because there were so many times we wanted to do something that the union wouldn't let us do it. We thought it was in your guys' best interest to have it happen. And he almost kind of felt like maybe the unions kind of felt that they didn't want that coming from the business, because it might make the unions look bad. I don't know if that was true or not, but there definitely is that thing where there could be some pressure from the management on different ways that of perception, and so as a result of which, usually, and again, if you're the HR person that's going through a unionizing election, get a lawyer. Make sure you follow the lawyer's advice in terms of what you can and cannot do. Because this is one of those things. You screw up in the wrong way, next thing you know, you've got the NLRB crashing down on you, and that's the last thing you want done. So once the signatures are gathered, the NLRB is petitioned to move forward with the secret ballot election. An alternative to the secret ballot election is the card check method. And that's, I'm sorry, I kind of jumped ahead on this, in which the union organizer provides the company with an authorization card signed by the simple majority. That's half plus one. And if the employer accepts the cards as proof the employees desire a union, they have it. The union then, the NLRB then certifies the union, and they begin collective bargaining. I'm not, I don't know if I've seen or heard of that method being done. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. But I could see where it's a little bit more perilous, because if you think about it, if I hand over a bunch of cards that have some signatures, management's going to recognize those signatures and want to crack down on some of those people if they just say, no, we're not going to accept this. I could see where the 30%. I remember when we had talked about it in another organization that I was affiliated with. I know when they had done their union, it was under the 30% method. I couldn't imagine that too many organizations do it by the second method. The organization does not accept the card check as authorized. The second option is a secret ballot. Before its method is used, you must petition the NLRB, and the election is usually held 2 months after the petition is filed. In essence, employees vote whether to unionize or not, and there must be a simple majority. NLRB is responsible for logistics and counting of ballots. Observers from all parties can be present during the counting of ballots. Once votes are counted, a decision on unionization occurs, and at that time the collective bargaining process begins. Once the NLRB is involved, there may be limits as to what an employer can say or do. That's when you want to make sure you got your lawyer, because what's going to end up happening is there's going to be some people who are going to come in and they're going to say, hey, look, the company wants to convince the employees, don't do this. Because what ends up happening is it ties your hands on a lot of things, and it's not just how much you pay your employees. It can also be safety procedures. It could be investigations. There's just a whole host of things that can get tied up if you end up having a union being formed. So there's just some things that you want to make sure that you do correctly. You want to make sure that you go through a lawyer. The lawyer should do a good job of helping you through that. They said 11.5 is things that you should never say during a unionization process. I think some of this are no offense, I think there's the duh factor is pretty high on some of these. Threaten or discharge employment, or threaten with discharge or punishment, threaten to terminate because of unionization, threaten layoff, loss of job, benefits, salaries because of unionization, threaten to shut down business because of unionization, question about union matters such as how an employee votes, or any of that stuff. I just think that there's just some things that you just don't want to do. It'll get you into more trouble than it's worth. And again, talk to a lawyer. A lawyer's going to tell you what you can and cannot do, and all that stuff. They provide training to organize. Okay, so they talk about unions are also very politically involved, support candidates they feel best represent labor. That's an interesting sort of thing because traditionally, they've swung one way, but it seems like in 2016 they swung a different way. So it's kind of interesting. Although I don't think the unions really had as much to say about that as the members did, because it seemed like the unions still the unions themselves kind of still wanted to stay with the traditional method, but. They provide training to organizers, sometimes encourage union supporters to apply for a job in non-union environments to actively work to unionize them. They call this salting. This can actually be very precarious work. I've never seen salting happen. I won't say that it doesn't. But again, you have to be very careful when you're trying to hire employees, and if you're worried about a salting case taking place, again, I think you just need to get a lawyer and basically say, lawyer, help me figure out what's going on. We think this person's salting. What can we do and what can we not do? I think at that point you've got a real issue on your hands when that takes place. And again, I think probably the big thing is that if they figure out that somebody's salting, the first intended, and it's a natural reaction, the boss wants to go in and say, okay, we're going to fire the guy. Well, you can't fire him for just talking to people about unions. It's a violation of rules and regulations to do that. So what are you going to do? Well, then another option is that, company all of a sudden wants to start talking to people about, hey, forming a union would be a bad idea, and here's the reasons why not to form a union. We care about you, and these are all the things that we do. Again, you start getting into a lot of these areas here where you might say, hey, it's going to cost us more in labor costs, and as a result of which we're probably going to have to lay people off. Now you've just threatened layoff, loss of job or benefits or salary because of the unionization. You've just created what I would call the duh factor. Again, I think that once you get into this case, legal beagles need to be involved, and HR people are very good for most of this, but at that point you probably want the lawyers. And here's the thing, folks. We as HR people, we are the people who have to go to management and say, you have to get the lawyer. Because they're not going to walk in and basically say, hey, HR person, I just think the lawyer is going to be needed in order to handle some of this stuff. That's not what's going to happen. Management, particularly operations, particularly even I would say sometimes even the HR folks do, because here's the thing: if a union's going to be formed, think about the people who feel most, shall we say, guilty first. The first people that feel guilty is operations, because they feel, well, if they're feeling like they want to unionize, it's probably because we haven't done our job, or it's going to make me look like I haven't done my job. Even worse, right? Sometimes HR people are going to feel the same way. Maybe we didn't, because of the compensation package we wanted to do, it didn't get approved. That's causing a lot of the strife and things of this nature. And I don't bring this up so much as to talk about feelings, half as much as to say, look, these guys are going to want to trip over themselves in order to prevent that from happening, and as a result of which, accidentally say something that they're not supposed to say. And so again, at that point, we're the HR people, we're the cool heads in the room. We need to stop and basically go to senior management and basically say, look, sir, I think a lawyer is necessary at this point in order to make sure that we don't do something stupid. There are three main phases of unionization. Phase one is that it's union-free. There's little or no interest in unionizing. Phase two, you learn some of the employers are discussing unionization, or you learned about a specific attempts by the union to recruit employees. Phase three, you receive a petition by the NLRB filed by the union requesting a unionization vote. That's kind of how this ends up working. Phase two is kind of where, we start having the aw stink moment, and that's where we kind of start getting worried because, and like I said, it's not. Again, I'm of a mixed bag of this, whether a union is a good thing or a bad thing, but. Obviously as an HR person, we don't want to be the person on the job when a unionization takes place because maybe it's something that we did. The most important thing is to divorce yourself of emotions, think logically, think rationally. Once you start hearing about this stuff, start talking about it with senior management, but then also get lawyers involved to make sure that you don't do something crazy. In phase three, when you actually have been handed these signatures that you want to vote, you can organize meetings to inform managers on the rules that are going to happen, again with lawyers' help. At this time, you will likely want to draw up an anti-union campaign and communicate that to managers, but also make sure it doesn't violate laws, again with the lawyers' help. To this end, develop specific strategies to encourage employees to vote no for the union. Some of the arguments might be union dues are costly. This isn't a hard argument to make, in my opinion, other than the employees probably won't know this because, of course, the union's not going to tell them what the dues are, until after the vote. But I remember mine. I think I mentioned it was like $60 out of my paycheck, and I was only making $500, a paycheck, and that's a lot of money for me. Nowadays it doesn't seem so much, but it does. Employees could be forced to go on strike. And that's the thing. Usually when the employees will make a vote as to whether to go on strike or not, but if you got a 50% or majority and you go on strike, all of you are on strike. And if you cross that line when a strike is taking place, it can be a very precarious situation for your employees. And so you want to make sure, your employees want to, take that into consideration. Maybe they don't want to go on strike because here's the problem when you go on strike, you lose all your wages. Now, the unions will generally have funds set up in order to, but it's not much. I remember when Kaiser went on strike in Spokane. This was back in, I want to say it was mid-90s. Yeah, I think it was mid-90s. I remember they were talking something like 30 cents on the dollar of whatever you were making. That's not a lot of money, guys. Now, some states will have it to where you can go on unemployment during this time, and the unemployment insurance can be made to work with that, but it's really state dependent at that point. Employees and management may no longer be able to discuss matters informally and individually. That is actually a factual statement. Once you have that, I remember when we were in meetings where employees would constantly want to ask information on certain things, management would say, we can't discuss it. And, some of the employees took it offensive because, maybe management doesn't trust us or doesn't like us or blah, blah, blah. And I said, and of course I understood a lot of this because I just knew it. I said, look, it's probably because management can't talk to us because we're union. I never took it personally when it happened, but I do know a lot of employees who did take it personally when management wouldn't tell us certain things that they couldn't tell us. Unionization can create bureaucracy. This is true. because of, if you've got a union that's running, there's certain people who are going to have to be hired in order to make sure that the union's being maintained, the union relationship's being maintained. Individual issues may not be discussed, and that's true. Say, for example, you have a unionized employee who hasn't come to work in a couple days, shows up 3 days later and says, "Hey, boss, I'm sorry I wasn't here. I had a family emergency, and I had no way to contact you for whatever reason." This probably wouldn't happen as much today because of cell phones, but if the employee says, "I'm sorry about this. I really apologize. If I can just go back to work, dock my pay for the days I wasn't here, obviously, and I'll make sure this never happens again." The employer may not have a choice. Because, if it's one of those things that's listed in the collective bargaining agreements that says if these things take place, you must do an investigation, or if these things take place, you must notify the union. If these things take place, you must do this. And there's some cases that if they don't, so say for example, say this is an employee who has a really great relationship with management, even though he's unionized. And the unions come back to him, the management comes back to him and says, "Yeah, we'll let him slide. He's a good worker. We don't have any major problems with him." So they do that. 2 weeks later, we have another employee who's not a good worker, who's a slacker, who decides to do the same thing, disappears, comes back, uses the same excuse, verbatim. Okay? And then you want to bring the hammer down on that employee because the employee's not a good employee. You think that the employee may be lying through their teeth, and you want to bring the hammer down, do an investigation, run through the union process. Union can come back and basically say, you took this guy and didn't do anything with him. Why are you taking this person and doing this? I think you're playing favorites here. And next thing you know, you've got an incident that ends up having to go to the NLRB in order to get it solved. When in this fact, the same thing that could happen is you just run the process, and with the first employee, usually what will end up happening is the members of the union will come back and say, "This was obviously a mistake, blah, blah, blah," so on and so forth. And you can say, "Okay, yeah, we kind of feel that way too. We'll let this one slide." Okay, because you went through the whole process, you've actually done that. And then 2 weeks later, you have the exact same thing happen. You still go through that exact same process. The union really doesn't have a leg to stand on if they come back and say, "Well, you're treating this unfairly because you didn't use the process on this person, but you're trying to use the process on this person." And so, again, it creates bureaucracy. It creates downtime. Maybe this person can't go back to work while you're arguing the case with the union. And so what's happening? Are they put on paid leave? Are they put on administrative unpaid leave? There's a whole host of things that have to take place as a result of which. Conversely, if this was like my own company and a person did this, I could say, "Oh, what happened? Oh, your mom's in the hospital? Oh, I'm sorry to hear about that. Yeah, you know what? Don't worry about it. Just go back to your desk and go back to work. I've solved it in 2 minutes." Okay? You can't do that in a unionized environment because there's going to be rules and procedures that are set up into place. Many decisions within a union, such as vacation time, are based on seniority only. Yeah, unions tend to hold the idea of seniority and tenureship very high. And so what ends up happening as a result of which, you may have the seniority, of course, being the thing. Just because someone's been there the longest doesn't necessarily mean they're the best employee. And so, and I've seen where, I remember when we were at the Doubletree, one of our managers wanted to he told us a story later on after we were deunionized, but he said, "I really wanted to reward me, and there was another employee who had just been hired, but we were hired at a time when they really needed somebody to come in and just hit the ground running and step up. And the two of us just came in and we rocked it." He said, "I wanted to give you a reward. We reached out to the union and asked if we could do this, and they denied it." Okay? Because they're like, "Well, you want to give it to these other two guys. What about the other two who've been working hard, who've been working for you for 15 years? And he said, at that point, it was like, well, why would I give it to everybody? Because, Kevin and this other lady, I won't say her name, worked hard. Why would you? Why wouldn't I? I mean, that just kind of destroys the purpose. So sometimes it can really cause some issues. So it says here, with unionization in decline, it is likely you may never need to handle a new union in your organization. However, with organizations such as Change to Win is an organization that's really working hard to increase union memberships. And it's working with these 4 unions that end up being there. And I could see food and commercial workers and farm workers being an area of potential growth in the next few years. But this book was written in 2011, and we've not really that trend hasn't reversed in the past 7 years. But who knows? Next thing you know, we could have there's I know with some of the tariffs that President Trump has put into effect, we've had an increase in the number of the steel industry starting to come back. Maybe it's possible that union membership goes up in those areas in order to see some things happening. I know that there's been a lot of industries and a lot of manufacturing industries that are starting to see some growth, which were in decline for many years. So that might have a turnaround in this in some way. So the impact of unions on organizations. And they talk about why unions are opposed. I think I've gone way into that, way too deep, and I'm not going to go too much to it. They talk about how, I will talk about this, they say they receive higher wages. Not just higher wages. I would say it's the benefits that they receive. I remember when we were unionized, my vacation time was much juicier than the non-union person was. My pension benefit was going to be much higher than anybody who was non-unionized. Of course, when I was in my 20s, I was bulletproof, so I wasn't going to need a pension. I was going to live forever. I didn't need to retire. Now that I'm in my 40s, I'm kind of like, I don't know, man. I think by the time I get to my 60s, I'm going to be, my goal is to sit on a beach and drink margaritas all day long. But that's neither here nor there. It said in 2010, the Art Institute facility filed signatures to vote unionization. Some of the major issues were scheduling issues, office space, not necessarily pay and benefits. So there's a wide range of issues that could cause people to want to unionize, and it's not always just pay. And just kind of take that into, it's generally, I think it's more or less fairness. I think it's fairness, to be honest. I think usually when you start hearing about people who want to unionize, it's because they feel that they're being unfairly treated. So in this section, we're going to talk about the collective bargaining process, and the learning objectives for this are to be able to describe the process of collective bargaining, understand the types of bargaining issues and rights of management, and discuss some strategies in working with unions. So the process of collective bargaining, with the bargaining agreement, certain management rights are non-negotiable, including the right to manage and operate the business, hire, promote, or discharge employees. If somebody does something that's illegal, you have the right to fire them. Now they're probably gonna put a process of grievance in, so that if you try to fire somebody who's not supposed to be fired, that'll end up being taken care of. But that's kind of how that works. It also says management has rights also include the ability of the organization to direct the work of employees and to establish operational policies. You will, as an HR professional, probably be at the bargaining table when all this stuff happens, if you're at a sufficiently high enough level. Or if this is your expertise, you will probably be called in to be at the bargaining table. It's important to be there to make sure that the strategic process is adhered, and that the strategic plan does not, and tie the strategic plan with the concessions the organization is willing to make and concessions the organization is not willing to make. Again, that gets back, and we've talked about that with that foundation. The strategic plan files for everything, and then those pillars. Your deals with unions are going to say, for example, if they're going to sit there and say you're an organization that prides itself on financial compensation for doing good work. Maybe you work in a sales force, for example, and you want to reward people with additional financial compensation to do that. Oftentimes, unions are probably going to not want that. They're going to want more stable, more stable stuff, more stable forms of financial compensation, where it's or more objective forms of financial compensation. So, for example, if you're going to base it on the number of cars that get sold, okay, but there has to be free and unfettered access to sell those cars. So if you're going to, they may put down some rules as to how people get access to the new clients that are coming in. That might be a way that they do this. Although and that's probably why you don't see a whole lot of unions at car dealerships. Most, people who work at car dealerships, even though I think they're overworked, I'd have a very good friend of mine who owns, or doesn't own, he works for a car dealership. He works his butt off. But he's very good at what he does, and he wouldn't want somebody telling him how he can get paid. He wants to go out there and earn his own money, and so I think that's probably one of the reasons why he wouldn't go along with this. But for example, as a bartender, one of the things that always kind of gets talked about is tips compensation. How is tips going to be handled? And it was in our collective bargaining agreement that tips were basically whatever the person paid us over the table belonged to us, not to a collective pool that would then go to somebody else. And they wanted to make sure that happened. So that was actually a very useful thing for that. Another important point in the collective bargaining process is the aspect of union security. Obviously, it's in the union's best interest to collect dues from its members and recruit as many new members as possible. In the contract, a checkoff provision may be negotiated when an employer, on the behalf of the union, automatically deducts dues from the member's paycheck and ensures a steady stream of dues. And that's how it happened with me. I wasn't given a choice on this matter. It basically was, you were going to be a bartender. As a member of the bartender, you have to join the union. We're going to take money out of your paycheck to pay your dues. And I didn't even see the money, other than it was a notation in my paycheck. This is how much money you had. So to recruit new members, union may require something called the union shop, where it requires, and union shop is basically where it requires that once you go to work at a place that is covered by a union, you have to join the union within a specified amount of time. And this is a security measure for them. And one of the reasons why they do this is, unions aren't cheap. And look, I don't necessarily, again, I'm 50-50 on either way. I can understand why unions do this, because if you think about it, if a person gets all the benefits of being covered by the union, but they don't have to pay for those benefits in order to become, part of the union, it sort of, it causes some issues. These other people who, are part of the union who pay, in my case, it was $60 every other paycheck. These other guys don't have to pay that much, and it's not, it's not really fair if you think about it, for that to happen. But then conversely, I don't have a choice, and I don't like that. Again, my libertarian side kind of goes, hey, wait a minute. I don't like the idea. I don't like the idea that I'm not going to be allowed to choose whether I join something or not. And I remember when I worked at Doubletree, I was required to join. I think it was, I can't remember if it was 30 days or 60 days. But I signed up. I think it took me, I signed up as I got hired. So I don't think it was that big of a deal. But then they took money out of my paycheck and went right to the unions. Now they have these things called right to work laws. And right to work, sometimes people might go, well, what's right to work? Don't we all have a right to work? Right to work laws, one of the big components of right to work laws is that they make this thing of a union shop illegal. So they cannot compel people who work for an organization that's covered by a union to join the union. Now, what will end up happening, there's this thing called an agency shop that is similar to a union shop that workers do not have to join, but the union must still pay union dues. Agency shop union fees are known as agency fees and may be illegal in right to work states. So again, you got to be really careful as to what your laws are for the unions that you have. And again, whether you want to join the union or not, if you have an agency fee that's required, you're still paying the money. You might as well join the union and get the benefits, in my opinion, but that's just me. A closed shop is a mechanism for a steady flow of membership also. And what a closed shop, as opposed to an open shop, we'll talk about that in a second, but a closed shop is essentially where you have to be a member of the union in order to get hired. So the closed shop arrangement actually has been made illegal under the Taft-Hartley Act. Now, according to a study with CNBC, all 22 right-to-work states are in the top 25 states for having the best workforces. However, according to the AFLCIO, the average worker in right-to-work states make about $5,000 less per year than other workers. And you can kind of see where some of these right-to-work states are, and all that in there. So then they talk about examples of bargaining topics, and they give those here. I'll put them up on the screen, and we can kind of go over some of them. Some of the biggest things that I see: health plans. That's a major discussion. Sometimes what will happen is the health plan is actually managed by the union, and they're required to do the union's plan, especially if you have a situation where union shops are actually there. They talk about seniority, and then of course some of the other things they do is talking about tools being provided to employees and the like. So then they talk about steps in the collective bargaining process. I'll let you kind of take a look at that for yourself with this. And here's the big picture about collective bargaining processes. It's a negotiation. All right, you are not going to get 100% of what you want. I don't care if you're the union or you're the business. You're not going to get 100% of what you want. The most important thing is to get down to the point where you guys can come to an agreement to do various things. Now, a lot of the things that you're going to want to agree to is going to be things you would want to do in the first place. But again, there's the art of the deal where you walk in saying, this is what I'm going to accept. They say, this is what I'm going to accept, and I'll give you the top view. And then over time, you just kind of work down to where you guys meet in the middle. And that's kind of how many negotiations go. Now, of course, it depends on who's a good negotiator. Sometimes you get a business where the leader is just pissing and moaning and all upset about the fact he's about to be unionized, doesn't negotiate very well, and gets taken to the cleaners. Well, then that goes very bad, too. If there's a bargaining impasse, there's various ways that this can be done. Strikes can take place. Sometimes what will end up happening, usually to do a strike, there has to be a vote on the strike. Where again, and it depends on the union contract. They may, usually it's a majority, which means 50% plus one person. Sometimes, it might be that it requires a 2/3 vote. Sometimes it may require that in order to give and sometimes they'll do this in advance where you'll walk into the negotiating because you're going to talk about an issue. And the union's already gone ahead and taken a vote on, we can call the strike if we don't think we're getting treated fairly. The members have already voted this. Okay, I know there's been some times where unions will do that because it puts, now if I sit down and I've just told you, our union members have voted 50% plus one for a strike, or whatever percentage for a strike, if we do not come to an agreement that we find acceptable. You have just put the other side on a bad bargaining end with regards to this. As opposed to if the union comes in and basically says, okay, we're gonna go back to our members, we're gonna say that you guys were unfair, blah, 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 and they're gonna tell their unions what happened in the negotiations. You're gonna tell your employees what happened in the negotiations, and as a result of which, they're gonna, maybe the employees say, you know what, union, you kind of asked a lot, and I'm not willing to go unemployed for this one issue. It can be a very interesting circumstance with that sense. Then they say here, some unions will engage in a sit-down talk, in a slowdown instead of strike. Slowdowns are basically where what it happens is, maybe I'm used to producing 10 wheels an hour, or not 10, well actually that's pretty slow. Maybe I'm used to doing, my factory produces, 10 wheels every unit of time, and I slow it down to 5. now I'm, and here's the thing, a lot of these factories work on fixed cost measures. So, and if you've ever taken an accounting course, managerial accounting course, we always try to encourage people to get things to move to fixed costs as much as possible. And the reason why is because at fixed costs at high volumes, your cost per unit decreases with that time, as opposed to with variable costs, I get no cost reduction by producing more. And so if I've gone and leveraged myself to where I'm maybe 80% fixed cost versus 20% variable cost, a slowdown, all of a sudden I'm getting my costs are jacking up my per unit cost, and maybe it's getting to the point where it's no longer allowed. Sick outs. This is also something that can happen when when members of a union call in sick. I remember there were some teachers that did this where, they were going to have a thing, and, all the teachers called in sick, and I was just kind of wondering how those calls went. I mean, did somebody get on the phone? Principal, things aren't all that well. Or did they just call in and say, yep, I'm calling in sick, thank you very much, click. Maybe I'm just thinking of weird things, but how do you do a sick call? I mean, do you at least try to sound like you're sick? I don't know. I've never, when I was a member of the union, we never did this, so I have no knowledge of that. They may, so the type of, they say this type of tactic may be illegal. It may be illegal if the conduct is irresponsible or indefensible, according to a judge. So if you have everybody calling sick, and then they're kind of like, okay, we think you organized this, and the judge comes down and strikes down your sick call, it's ruled illegal. Everyone's got to go back to work. Okay, it can cause some interesting things. Jurisdictional strikes are used to put pressure on an employer to assign work to members of one union versus another, if there are two unions within the organization, or put pressure on management to recognize one union representation when it currently recognizes another. If you're in a business that has multiple unions, God bless you, because it's difficult to negotiate with one union, let alone 3 or 4 who are all trying to compete for various things, especially when they say, well, you just told the SEIU you're going to give them this, why are you not giving our people this? It's kind of like, and not to put down unions, but it's like if you have multiple kids, you give one kid, oh, you want some apple juice, go ahead and have some apple juice, and then you got the other kid who comes up, what? Well, Susie got apple juice, why does Susie get apple juice? I want apple juice. And then you're like, okay, I'll give you apple juice too. It kind of gets to that thing. Sometimes they try to play you off of each other, or they try to they just try to play you off of each other and get what they want out of it. So in this section we're going to talk about administration of a collective bargaining agreement, and the learning objectives to be able to explain how to manage the grievance process. So the grievance process, I remember I'm old, so I used to watch a show called Perfect Strangers, and it was a show where they had, a guy who was an American. I think he grew up in Michigan or Milwaukee or something like that, and he had moved to Chicago because he was going to be, he wanted to be a cameraman or something of that nature for like a, photographer for a newspaper. Well, he had this cousin that came from some country. It was a made-up country, but the country was supposedly like the Mediterranean country. So like, this guy grew up with, goats, and all that sort of stuff. So he was, needless to say, it was a comedy. So, the guy was kind of a little goofy, and all that sort of stuff. And the guy who's the immigrant comes in and he's like, he's crying and he's crying. And the other guy comes up to him and he says, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? I don't understand. Why are you all upset? He says, I've just been selected for the grievance committee, so I'm going to go ahead and practice being grievanced. And the guy's like, no. Let me explain what the grievance committee does. And that's when he talked about what the grievance committee was. And the grievance committee, of course, is, in an organization that's non-union. That's kind of like a sort of side subject. Some organizations will actually create grievance committees to make sure that if somebody's breaking the rules, there's a process for people to tell on that person, or at least accuse that person of doing it without really getting a whole lot of management involvement, simply because of the fact that management's too busy doing the stuff that they're doing. Common things like parking issues, people parking in the wrong parking spot. I can send somebody to the grievance committee for that, and so on and so forth. But in union cases, so the procedures for the grievance, when you have a violation in the contract, in terms of the perception or violation, normally results in a grievance. And take, for example, I have the two workers that come in, and I have the one that I like, so I go ahead and I let him go, and then the second one I don't like, so I go ahead and fire him. The union could then come back to me and say, hey, wait a minute, you didn't follow the procedures in order to fire this individual. And then moreover, you let this other person go for the exact same offense. And so they're going to file a grievance. And the grievance, usually the process in the grievance is going to be laid out in the contract that gets negotiated. Usually you'll have to sit down and come to a negotiated settlement. Now, here's the thing. If the person legitimately did something wrong, oftentimes what's going to happen is the union's going to be like, look, and I'll use a gun analogy, I've only got so many bullets in my gun. I'm not going to save somebody who deliberately did something stupid, and as a result of which, and the union sometimes is going to, with some people, they'll go ahead and they'll do that. I've seen only in a couple cases where the union basically said, we're going to defend this person even though it's indefensible. And sometimes they're only doing that simply because they don't want to give an appearance of favoritism either. But oftentimes what will happen is unions, and this is just on my personal experience, I've seen it where unions will sometimes they'll know when to pull the trigger, so to speak. We really want to save this person because they've done nothing wrong, and you'll have somebody who was fired and they should never have been fired. Okay, the grievance process, the union goes up and says, look, they shouldn't have been fired. Here's what happened. This person had a legitimate reason to do what they did. Don't fire them. And if the collective bargaining agreement sides with them, maybe management backs down. Okay, you could have the opposite thing that takes place. The person was a horrible person. Maybe he set off a fire extinguisher as a practical joke, as a result of which 2 people went to the hospital. The union may not want to defend the guy. Okay, and in that case, you send him through this process, and the union kind of just goes, okay, we agree he did something really stupid, and as a result of which we're okay with you firing him. It can happen. They don't necessarily protect everyone, particularly if they know that it's not something that's worth their time, but more importantly, if they know that the person was different. Now, your grievance process is going to happen in between the two, normally, and you're going to have to figure out, and sometimes it's good to figure out, is the person justifiably a bad person? Is the person justifiably being fired? Sometimes, management, let's be honest, managers sometimes play favorites. It happens. So you want to find out what all your facts are in order to before you start going up with this. And I love how they do this. They talk about, I'm getting ahead of myself. So many grievances never go further than this step, which is the first step, which is an informal conversation with a manager and an employee. And then oftentimes, this will clear up like misunderstandings. Oh, you wanted me here at 9 instead of 9:30 today because of the whatever. I apologize. I never got the message, blah, blah, blah. It will never happen again. And sometimes you can have that informal meeting where it's just done. Sometimes what will happen is in the informal agreement, the union rep will have to be there just to make sure everything goes on the up and up. But generally speaking, sometimes you can have an informal conversation. I remember there was like something I had done. I'd broken a bottle of, I think it was vodka or something like that because I was a bartender. And, you know, the management, you know, instead of doing something formal, they just brought me aside and said, Kevin, you know, be more careful, blah, 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 so on and so forth. I didn't have any union membership representation there. I wasn't being punished. I think it went down as an informal counseling, and that was it. You know, something like that, there was a process to get that done. It was resolved, and we moved on. If the complaint is unresolved at this point, however, the union will normally initiate a grievance process by formally expressing it in writing. At this time, HR management may discuss the grievance with the union representative. So if it's unsatisfactorily resolved to both parties, the complaint may be brought to the union's company grievance committee, and this can be formed in the form of an informal meeting or a more formal hearing. And it'll depend on what you're dealing with here. I remember when I was at the hotel, we had a situation where, and I think I talked about this in a previous video, we had a situation where an employee was drinking on the job. And I remember, you know, the union rep came to me, and I never told management this, but the union rep came to me and said, do you think she was drinking? And I said, oh yeah, I smelled her breath. I know she was drinking. And it was, you know, I mean, she was drinking gin, and I mean, I'm glad I wasn't smoking cigarettes around her at that time, because I probably would have blown up. I mean, that's how strong it was. She was drunk on the job, and so when the union rep came to me with that, they were like, okay, you know, and I remember they got it resolved pretty. It was an informal decision. The union rep was there at the time, you know, and it was done. I've never actually heard of a formal thing going. Again, my short amount of time that I was actually part of the union, we probably just didn't have this happen. But I could imagine it's one of those things. It kind of works like an administrative court, so to speak, where you have the union rep representing you, and then the management representing you, and maybe a third-party arbitrator that takes place, or a grievance committee can also be taking place. And the grievance committee is going to be made up of a wide variety of people, and could include parties from both sides. And if a resolution cannot be done with the grievance committee, you know, then you know, they talk about you know, well, they talk a little bit about this down here, blah, blah, blah. If no resolution develops, then you may have an arbiter, if you haven't had one already. And usually it's binding arbitration. So whatever the arbiter says is done. You know, and again, with this drunk employee, had we pushed it, you know, and had they not talked to me first, or talked to somebody else first about it, and had they pushed it to where they, you know, just didn't get to that point, I could almost guarantee you a binding arbitrator would have sided with the company on this, because, you know, as a bartender, I mean, number one, it's illegal to drink on the job. I don't know of a state that does not prohibit that. You know, she should have been arrested, let alone, you know, fired. And in fact, I'm shocked they didn't call police in to deal with that in the first place. But I think she had some personal issues, and I think they were just trying to be, they're like, look, we can't have you working here like this. And as I recall, I think the union tried to take care of her and get her some help that she needed, so that was actually a good thing. Some examples of grievances: one was promoted over another, even though they had seniority. This is what chafes me under the union side, though, is that just because somebody should not necessarily be promoted, in my opinion, because of seniority. They should be promoted because they work the hardest, they know the most, they've taken invested interest in developing their education, a variety of things. Should you be held back for promotion because you went out and got a college degree, and your buddy over here sat at home on Saturday nights and did nothing, not improving themselves, but because they were there for 3 months longer than you, they get promoted, you don't? That just chased me a little bit. That's part of the reason why I'm still 50-50 on it, but that's just my opinion. An employee doesn't have the tools needed to perform their job. As outlined in the contract, an employee was terminated, even though termination violated the rules of the contract. And that's where you're going to see this very common. Somebody was fired, they shouldn't have been fired, and that's where it happens. An employee was improperly trained. I have seen grievances like that. Usually usually management just says, okay, we'll send them for more training. This wasn't, I mean, at least it happened that way in the DoubleTree. The person just felt like they didn't get enough training, and so they weren't happy about that. So yeah, so here's the other thing that's big about this. sometimes your employees will be afraid to file grievances, and the reason is because they're afraid they're going to get fired. If that ever happens, the union can basically say, well, that's very nice, we're going to file it on your behalf, because we just think that it needs to be done. I've never heard of this happening in my life personally. I know a friend of mine who had this happen on them and in fact, he didn't even go to the union and complain. It was that somebody had complained to the union on his behalf. The union came to talk to him about it, and he said, well, I don't think it's a big deal. But because the union thought it was a big deal from their perspective, they wanted to file a grievance on it. And I guess that in his union shop, they had signed something that said, I agree to let the union file it on my behalf if I don't file it on mine. So it can actually cause some issues in that sense, and I remember, he was distraught because he wanted to tell the management, I really don't have a problem with this, but of course he wasn't allowed to because that would have violated the rules of the union. So it can cause some issues. All right, guys, so that's all I have for you this time. I know unions can be kind of again, it's a hot button issue because I know a lot of people have passions on both sides. The most important thing for you to do is divorce your personal instincts and your personal feelings from something, from this topic, and do what's in the best interest of the company, because that's who hires us. Okay, again, if you're not part of my class and you have some questions, feel free to leave comments in the box below. If you are part of my class and you want to get in touch with me, feel free to reach out to me at my school email. You have that email address, or you can contact me on my work phone number, and you have access to that through the system in Leo. I thank you very much for watching this video, and have a good day.